So I was asked to talk about safety planning as it applies to general homeless housing and what that looks like for housing programs who are not specifically dedicated to domestic violence. I just had that. Oh, that's me again. Okay. So really quickly, I have a shorter period of time than what this PowerPoint usually, I do a little bit more. We're not going to really go deep diving into what domestic violence is or isn't, but I am going to do a quick overview of that just for context. I can just say though, if you do want me to have one of my team come in, or myself, I don't usually do the presentations anymore, but if you want or need someone to come in and do a presentation on a deeper dive regarding domestic violence and some of the things that you might think about or hear about here today, we can certainly do that. But we do want to understand what it is and what it is not. That's a key thing to think about, what it's not. We want to identify some signs. We wanted to talk about how to respond to disclosures. That's a big thing for housing providers when all of a sudden it's disclosed in that moment of filling out applications. And then also safety planning with victims, orders of protection, program staff and safety, another thing to really think about. And then what our local domestic violence services are. Okay, so really quickly, the big key for us on domestic violence is that it's a pattern of abusive behavior that one person uses to obtain power and control over their intimate partner or a family member. So, we've all heard it's not just physical, and that's so true, particularly, it's a verbal, it's emotional, it's all those things. What you might see a lot in your work would be financial abuse as well, when someone doesn't have control over their own money and what that looks like. It's non-discriminatory, as we all know. It definitely hits every corner of the universe and all folks. And then it often increases in frequency over time. So coercive control is one of the things that we have to look at. The thing, this is a wheel that we have used over years. You've probably seen it 1,000 times if you've been ever in a domestic violence training. And it really talks to the different ways in which abusers and perpetrators of abuse use to maintain that power and control with physical, sexual, and then I think that's the only two on there. There are many, many wheels, and if you want a wheel that is tailored to the particular population that you work with, we definitely have wheels that go across every spectrum. So we have it for people who are also dealing with substance abuse. We have it for folks who are dealing with other challenges in their life. So a lot of the tactics, really quickly, threats and intimidation, obviously, but gaslighting is a term that we've heard a lot of most recently in our world. And that's a huge one. So when we have people that are trying to make other people believe that what the victim is saying couldn't possibly be true and how that functions, that impacts people trying to access services greatly. And those are some of the things that we worry about. Dictating and rules, isolation, imprisonment, reproductive and sexual coercion. People don't really, oftentimes women will say to us that they didn't want to have that baby, but they were forced to have that baby. Or the other way around, they wanted to have their baby and they were forced to terminate their baby. Things like that. So then there's the most traditional things that people think about when they think about the raging abuser, like extreme jealousy and physical harm and all those things. But you're going to see a lot of things that are much more subtle than that, and it's not going to be as blatant as that. So it's all the different tactics. We also talk a lot in other trainings about the different tactics that work depending on people's personal situations. So for instance, in the LGBTQ world, tactics that abusers can use are different than maybe in heterosexual relationships. The biggest thing is that outing. That's a big way to keep control over somebody. If they're not out to their family and such, an abuser can use that outing them as a way to keep control over them, which that would not be a variable in a heterosexual relationship. Oop, I don't know, go back. How do I go back? I missed one. Real quick. So abusers, it's not the big scary guy with the typical white, lack of a good term, wife beater tank top on. There's no typical abuser. They really come in all shapes and sizes as our victims, but they really have a true belief that they're entitled to be doing what they're doing, that they're entitled to have that control over their victim. They will minimize, they will deny, they will blame, they will avoid responsibility for their actions, and they generally will, that's where the gaslighting comes in as well. But it will escalate, their abuse will escalate if they feel like they're losing their control. Abusers choose to abuse. It is a choice. It is an absolute 100% choice on the abuser's side. And I say that because domestic violence is not a random, isolated, or arbitrary incident. It's not caused by the actions or the traits of the victim. It's not caused by mental illness or substance abuse. And it's not high conflict or mutual hiding. They choose to abuse, and people will say, well, when he's drunk, it's only because he's drunk. but he took a cab ride home, hopefully, from the bar, and he did not beat up the cab driver. He did not beat up the guys he was hanging out with at the bar. He did not beat up the bartender. So he chose to hit who. So it's a choice. It's not caused by those things. It's definitely not. A little bit about looking beyond the incident. A lot of times people focus really a lot on the physical abuse or what's happening in the moment. When you're working with folks, you have to really look beyond what exactly happened. You have to take a look at what was the context, what was the motivation, what was the impact, and the intent. So we know that survivors and victims of domestic violence do a lot of things to do just that, to survive, right? They may do something that looks really out of character or might look like they were the perpetrator of abuse. So when they hit back, the difference between was somebody hitting somebody to maintain control or was somebody doing it for self-defense. Some other things really quick that people might do when we talk about what was the context and what was the motivation is what was happening prior to the incident. What was happening, what was the reason that the person did whatever it is they did. Then what was the impact, and then what was the intent. So when we talk about that, a lot of the victims we talk to will talk about they have fear, they have dread. They'll be talking to you about they're like afraid to go home. They don't want to worry about tomorrow. They're afraid of what might happen if the housing application is denied. And they have this really intense, like you don't understand, like things are going to be really bad for me. The obvious things of injuries, illness, we're talking about trauma every day, the loss of independence, and basically the question we ask is whose life got smaller? So sometimes victims will be doing a lot of things and we'll be questioning that, but when you take a look at why and what they were doing and what was the reason they were doing it, and you can identify that it was in order to survive, then you're going to be able to assess where the DV and who's the perpetrator. So here's a huge thing that we talk a lot with people. So often we hear, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't he just leave? Why doesn't he just go? There are serious risks about seeking help and or leaving. So the escalated threats will happen, the escalated abuse will happen. We know that abusers will start to do more things in order to maintain that control. So there's a negative impact on children, women, and I say women, and I should preface it, most of the victims that we work with are women experiencing abuse from men. But it does definitely go both ways. But they're afraid of what's going to happen to the kids. They worry about what's going to happen in both ways, either the not having dad or mom in the house, or also what dad or mom might do to the kids because he's deciding to leave. Losing income or job. That is one of the number one things that we hear about. People are talking about, I need 2 incomes in order to support my family. If I leave, then what am I going to do? There's a hugely social negative, connotation to applying for emergency services from public assistance systems. So, they're really damned if they do, damned if they don't. Being blamed, not being believed. Another big thing, not being believed. And being pressured. So a lot of times too, what we find in some of the populations that we work with also, there are strong religious beliefs around divorce or around leaving and or whether or not what is acceptable behavior for a husband and onto and with a wife. So we work a lot with folks who are combating that in terms of trying to figure out safety planning and leaving. Then there's all these obstacles to leaving. And I'm going to send this out to you all so you can look at to reference. But there are a lot of obstacles. It's not as easy as people think. I know I have a great program. Unity House has a great program. But there's huge obstacles for them to leave and being afraid. When victims leave, it is the most dangerous time ever in the situation because the moment the abuser feels like they are losing control, stuff's going to hit the fan. So it really they've also a lot of times have left. We know that victims will leave many times. They also know, they know what happened the last time that they left and what can happen. A lot of the things, lack of safe shelter or housing, as great as a lot of our programs are and all of our programs are, people don't want to have to go into shelter. They do not want to go to shelter. So they weigh out, can I ride this out until? And then there's the partner promising to change, there's religious beliefs, there's one in the family, all that type of stuff. There's also a huge history of ineffective use of the legal system, and that's a whole nother training, in terms of what their experiences are when they say go seek help, but then what actually happens is a lot different than what people might believe. So then there are also some very specialized trainings that we can do in talking about some of the nuances and different things that you might want to consider when you're working with some of our marginalized populations, the LGBTQ community, elderly, persons with disabilities, immigrants, and teens and young adults. There's some special nuances, particularly with safety planning around those things. With teens and such, you have laws that apply to youth that don't apply to other people, persons who are here with difficult immigration statuses have fear of, particularly in this current political climate, much fear of repercussions if they should seek assistance. And some of the other things that we have to think about. People with disabilities and elderly folks, oftentimes the abuser or the perpetrator is a family member who's taking care of them. So if you take the abuser out of the house, who's going to take care of me, is a huge issue. So when we're talking about safety planning, because that's what this is about, you have to think of all those pieces. It can't just be, why don't you just leave? So then there's other considerations. It can last for years. I'm going to tell you right now, victims of domestic violence, the abuse lasts a lifetime. Now, whether or not they are currently in an unsafe situation or they're living as safe as possible is what we strive for. But once they have had somebody who's a perpetrator of abuse to them, the potential of that being live and active is forever. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. What do we want to do about it? So survivors of domestic violence can enter the housing system safely and confidentially when homeless and housing programs have developed policies and procedures with survivor safety in mind and minimize any unintended consequences. The unintended consequences is the thing that we really take a look at, because all the best of intentions, but if people don't really understand what those underlying issues are going to be, that can really impact victims. Staff that need to receive training to enhance awareness, sensitivity, and reduce victim blaming, and that collaborations are in place to address DV-related issues quickly and effectively. So that's where I come into play, and having partnerships with, which we do with many of the programs that are here. Safe processes. Now, I'm not going to read every single one of these, but these are multiple entry points and safe alternatives, cross-training, a transfer policy. If domestic violence has happened, that's a big thing, because housing programs have rules about if you get exited or if you have to transfer, what does that look like? So it's really important that staff and program safety policies and protocols are in place, and that staff are well trained on them, and that everything is VAWA, FHA, and HUD compliant, so that victims are protected against discriminatory like nuisance and other local ordinances. Nuisance ordinances has to do with like if they've called 911 too many times, and it wasn't, there are still communities that a person can be evicted and or be charged with nuisance ordinance like violations because of the ruckus that's being made by the abuser, or because the police have been called too many times to the house. So victims are afraid to call 911 because otherwise they face all these other sanctions in their communities. So that's a huge thing. Okay, so in terms of being a housing program, what you need to think about, your intake process can be one of the biggest places that you're going to catch some of this stuff, and an avenue for a victim to really be able to get assistance. So does your intake process address domestic violence? When I say address it, is there some way and some question on your form that asks somebody whether or not they might be experiencing, and then what does that look like? So these are things that you can ask if you think someone might be experiencing domestic violence. Do you feel safe at home? Is there anything we can do to make you feel more safe? But the biggest thing is to ask these things privately. If you're working with families and the couple is sitting in front of you, do not ask that person, whoever it is, do you feel safe at home? Or do you feel safe within your current situation? Because obviously they're not going to be able to answer honestly, but they're also possibly going to be blamed for why did that person feel the need to ask you that. Abusers know what they're doing, right? They're always on the watchful eye about what are people saying, why are people saying that. So you could potentially put that victim in a lot more danger. What it might look like, obviously the physical injuries and inconsistent explanations for it, hypervigilance and time watcher. If you're doing an intake with somebody and they are really nervous about like how long is this going to take, they're there with the kids, but they're like, I have to be home by 5, like I have to be home. That's an indication that someone's concerned and fearful of what's going to happen if I'm not. If they're missing frequent appointments, if they're actually abusing alcohol and substances, victims do a lot of things to self-medicate and deal with the trauma that they're experiencing. If you're meeting with a family and they're not able to speak or contribute to the conversation, so if the one party is answering all the questions and does not let the other party speak, or if you try to talk to the other party and the other person does not allow them to answer the question, that might be a clear indication that there's something going on, that that person has no agency in that situation and is probably experiencing abuse. No access to their finances. If they say, I have no idea, he took care of all the money, I don't have the checkbook, he has my paycheck directly deposited into his account, things like that, those would be clear indications that there's something going on. Safety and confidentiality. So big things to ask clients, like, is it safe to leave a voicemail identifying who you are? So when we call victims, if we don't have a safe number, we just simply say, hi, this is Christine, and leave it at that. if we're able to leave a voicemail, but not say that we're calling from Equinox. Asking them whether or not you can make a home visit, and do they want their partner there or not, and is it better to meet somewhere else? Those are all questions to really give the survivor the opportunity to decide and let you know what's safest for them. And then ask them if it's safe for them to bring brochures home. We have palm cards, we have all kinds of stuff we like to give, but what you might not realize is when that person goes home with all that information about domestic violence, someone could be on the other end of that, find that, and then that could cause a major safety issue for that person. So asking them first whether or not that is. We find often that if you have a lot of information about other programs and it's all just cupped together, then that's okay because it's like it's all just in the packet. But if they come home solely with information about domestic violence, that's a little bit telling. So being understanding, respecting the rights of domestic violence survivors to determine their own priorities and make their own life choices. This is a huge thing for service providers. We go on the belief that survivors and victims are the experts in their own lives and safety, even if it doesn't look that way to you. They have been managing, if they're meeting with you, they've made it this far and survived every day to get there, and they do a lot of things to make that happen. Survivors are spending all day, every day, thinking about how I'm going to be safe today. So you need to trust that if they say to you, that's not safe for me, and even though you might not understand why, they are right. They know what's safe and they know what's not safe. And they may do things that you feel are unsafe. Going home, people don't understand, why would she go home? Because it's safer for her to go home than it is for her not to, because he will find her, and it'll be more difficult for her if she didn't go home. So for staff when they're doing intakes and such, making sure there's no judgment, making sure that you're having appropriate reactions. You know, facial expressions are huge. Survivors also are hypervigilant and paying attention to all like cues that are coming from people. This is what they've had to do in order to maintain their own safety at home. They're very keen on watching what your tone sounds like, what your face looks like, what your body language looks like, because keep in mind, all day long, they're doing that with their abuser, because that way they can adjust what and how they have to do things depending on what the sound of what's going on. So don't assume you know what's best, ask how you can help. And ultimately what we would like is that you refer them to us and bring us in. You know, we don't expect all housing programs to have DV experts, you know, in their programs. This is just an overview to have an idea, but really we would want you to give us a call. If you have the opportunity to ask the survivor or the victim if they want you to call, is one thing, but you can, even if you're asking for and needing information about, I think this is what I'm seeing, you can give us a call and we can talk it through, and I can at least help guide you in what direction. Why is safety planning vital? Well, because fleeing or attempting to flee an abuser heightens the danger for DV survivors. It also helps them brainstorm new ideas about how to stay safe as possible. It's also coordinating strategies to keep them safe, and also talking through a plan can help identify risk situations and provide opportunities to mitigate the danger. Now, this is a really in-depth kind of a thing, but when they're living with you, there's a lot of variables they have to keep in mind about how to be safe if they're away from the abuser, but also if they might be currently in the situation. Safety planning is a personalized, practical plan that includes ways for victims to remain safe. One of the things to keep in mind is that it has to be guided by the victim. It cannot be something that is prescribed to them. Like I said, they are the experts in their safety, and they need to be the one that is doing it. A good safety plan is going to remember all the information that they need. It's going to be tailored to their unique situation. We frown upon checklists and safety forms. It should not be a form. Those should just be used as a guide to kind of help you think about the questions to ask about safety planning. And then remembering also that orders of protection are simply a piece of paper, and that they are only helpful if the abuser adheres to them, or that law enforcement helps enforce them as well. So when you're going to safety plan with someone, if they say to you, like, I'm moving in here, or I have this situation, I have an order of protection, these are things that you can do to help me. Find out the basic information. Find out if there's an OP in place. Find out, you know, who else is who else is going to be living in the home. Find out if the victim has access to their resources. Like, asking these questions is going to help really give you a better idea of how to help them navigate through some of these things. Do they have a disability or other needs for accommodation? That's a huge thing as well. Oftentimes victims do not feel like they can ask to have their needs met, and so asking them what else they might want or need. They may not be accustomed to being able to speak up for themselves and saying, like, I really need this. So being in tune to that. But also noting here, asking them who are people in their life they can trust, because what you don't want to become is the sole and only place or person that person has to trust, because they might not always be with you. So helping them figure out who in their life might be a support and helping connect that, whether that be family members, church members, other community supports and things like that, domestic violence support groups, is a good way to help them do that. Orders of protection, they do not guarantee safety, and they are only tools for helping them using their safety planning. I want to stress that because we have had a lot of, in the past at least, housing programs that will require someone to have an order of protection in order to live there. That if there is an incident that they will say you have to go and get an order of protection or you're going to be evicted, things like that, which is not legal, but oftentimes that has happened. And so what we need to realize is that victims have to be the ones to decide whether or not it is going to be safe for them to do that. Orders of protection can often cause a lot more problems for the victim than it helps. And it only stops the abuse if the abuser is actually going to abide by it. For some victims, it's been a super great tool. It has helped them be safe, and they've had really good success with it, but it's not always the case for people. Filing might escalate the abuse, you know, because what happens also, you file for an order of protection, now you've made them mad, right? Other instances, if they have fled and they're no longer living in the community with that person, and that person doesn't know where they have fled to, if I file for an order of protection, that opens up a whole can of worms about now he can potentially find out where I am, because you have to go into court. The other thing too is that, you know, when you're talking to victims, if they do have an order of protection, making sure that they really understand the terms of their OP, and if not, you know, give us a call as well, because the fine print, again, if they've done this without an advocate in the court with them, chances are they've gotten the piece of paper, they have a lot of ideas of what they think it covers, and the language is really important. So if you are helping someone with an order of protection, you want to understand what that means for your housing program. Is it a full stay-away order? So if you're running an apartment building and all of a sudden the abuser shows up and is knocking on the door and they're like, there's an OP, we're going to call the cops, and he's like, all it says is that I can't do anything illegal. I haven't done anything illegal. They do give out orders of protection that are just no illegal contact, which I find interesting because, I mean, I'm supposed to function in life that way anyway, right? You're not supposed to be breaking the law. But it might not be a full stay away. And so you have to really know that if you're going to be working with a survivor and helping them with their housing. And then also, what should happen if the perpetrator violates? So there's another thing. What are some of the safety planning things you might want to do if someone's living in one of your housing programs and the abuser shows up? You know, what are some of the things that they can do? What are the things that they should do? And then working with that victim to know for them what's the best point of action to take. Also really getting to know and understanding kind of like what's the threat level. You know, if this is someone who's never been physically violent with this person, then you might want to take one avenue. But if you know this person has been extremely physically violent, then you would probably want to take a different avenue. And then talking to them also about like who they should tell that they have an order of protection. Survivors often want to keep this stuff really private, rightfully so, but it's really helpful actually if people in their lives who are going to be supportive can help them and know that this exists. So if an abuser does show up and rings the doorbell at a job or at an office, like a services office, staff will know not to open the door. Okay, so areas to safety plan around. So we talked to survivors about if they're going to stay at home, about whether they're going to prepare to leave, and then if they're going to file court proceedings, if they're going to file custody papers and such, what does that look like? New York State has an address confidentiality program for victims of domestic violence. So if somebody is a domestic violence victim, they can have their mail redirected through a confidentiality program. The confidentiality program has their physical address, but there's like a post office box that they are given, and it is the only like PO box in the entire New York State that has to accept legal documents that are not normally allowed to go to PO boxes. They have to, so all the mail goes to that PO box, and then they send it to the victim at their home. So that way the abuser never has their physical address on where they're living. And it's also an address that's given out to other agencies and other things like National Grid and such, because what we might know is the ways in which abusers might try to track down and find a person is by finding out an address through some other means, some other account that someone has or some other program that someone's involved in. National Grid, it's very easy to call different places and pretend you are so-and-so and get information. You think that stuff is secure, but it's not. Okay, so the big thing here is being sure that the safety plan is the survivors and not yours, and really going over it and having realistic expectations. They may say to you, like, I don't know what to do. So it's okay to be having those conversations and giving suggestions, but at the end of the day, if those ideas don't sit well or resonate well or cannot be helpful to the victim, then that shouldn't be on there, right? Because we also know that they're going to be looking at that, and people are going to be looking at that and saying, well, why didn't you do this? And they'll be like, because that's not helpful to me. All right, so program and staff safety. Thoroughly discussing safety of the housing location. This is going to be different for every program, right? So depending on what your program looks like, whether you're an SRO program with a community room, whether you are a scattered site apartment program out in the community, you know, all the different ways that we have housing, you really have to tailor it for what makes sense for that type of a location. Discussing with the survivor how they want to handle seeing you in public. So for me, I've been doing this work a really long time. I also live in the community. I have to be super careful when I'm walking through my kid's high school and there's somebody who is currently living in our shelter and their child, you know, and those types of things. And you can see often, they'll see the look on their face, like they don't want, and I just keep it moving. Like I don't get to say hello to anybody unless they say hello to me. Now there are other folks who are like, hey, how are you? Oh my God, you know, and all that. But unless they approach me, I should never approach them. Because particularly if they're with a partner, and that partner's gonna say, so who is that? How do you know that person? And how are they gonna then explain how they know me? You know, that type of thing. So it's super important to be careful how you do that. Talking with children is another key thing. Talking to the survivor about really how much information do the children know. How much do the kids know about the safety plan? That's a whole nother caveat about trying to safety plan with kids who are of age to talk and want to bring kids home from school, and what does that look like, and those kinds of things. When you're home visiting, you definitely want to confirm the safety of the visit. We don't go anywhere to homes that we know that the abuser is currently living in. So every time you visit, though, you need to make that confirmation call. So if you're doing home visiting and you know that often the abuser may be in and out, whether it's because they're coming to see kids, whether or not they have, whatever the reason, you want to confirm, like, is it okay for me to come at this point? If you have a policy around you don't go ever when the abuser is there, then making sure that you confirm that each time that you go. Checking out, okay, if it's, you know, like I said before, whether it's okay to leave a message and what message looks like. Email is a huge thing to also consider, and there's a whole training about text safety for survivors and victims, which is actually a really cool training for probably everybody in the world, because you find out all these really awesome and yet creepy ways that you can like use technology to track and abuse and stalk people. You know, I'm going to tell you right now, they pose these things as like, moms, you can track your teenage kids, right? Well, abusers, you can track your victim, you know, and all you have to do is put an app on a phone and things like that. So making sure that you know that someone knows I mean, these are regular home visiting safety rules that we talk about, and most programs should have that. You should not be, if you think it's a dangerous situation, you're not going there by yourself. You know, that your agency knows where you're going, you've checked in with someone so that you know, are not just out in the community without people knowing where you are. Bringing a minimal amount of stuff with you and avoid looking like a social worker. That's a huge thing for survivors, right? Because the neighbors talk, people talk, and so all of a sudden, you know, I used to do home visiting stuff too, and inevitably I would hear, CPS is here, you know, social workers are here. So you just really have to kind of make sure that you know your environment and that you try to blend in as much as possible so you're not drawing attention to their homes if they don't want attention drawn. Knowing the name and the description of abusers is, if possible. You know, when in the work that we do, if there is someone who's very serious and has been really active, we often try to get a picture of that person and have them at our front desk so that the receptionist knows definitely not to like open the door and things like that. Having safety protocol for office staff, front desk, security parking lots. This is kind of going all right into now like the active shooter kind of stuff. But not necessarily to that level, but just what are your policies and protocols about if somebody shows up that's not supposed to be in your space, or that somebody has an order of protection against, or simply just doesn't want them to be there. A victim doesn't need to have an order of protection for them to tell you, I don't want you to let that person into my space. I mean, they have that right to say that without an OP. And have rehearsed responses. These are situations that in the moment we talk about it, but are we really talking about it and talking about what to say? Oftentimes we have frontline staff that are changing. We have turnover in our staff. Your admin assistants at the front desk may not be involved and have any clue about who's going on. But if there's a situation, do staff really know what to say and how, you know, not to say something inadvertently that could cause more danger for a victim? You know, our staff, it's grilled into them that they cannot confirm or deny. You've probably heard that if you've called our agency and tried to get information about a client, the first thing that they'll say is like, well, I can't confirm or deny if I even know that person. But really knowing like what are the things you should say, and sometimes we have put it up like little one-liners on like their desks, because when something's happening, your adrenaline's rising, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this is happening. And if it's not your everyday work, it's not gonna be a quick recall for them. So having panic buttons and emergency signals, I mean, those are just basic safety things. And then having a really good working relationship with our community police. Whatever community that you're in, talking to them about like, hey, what do we do in these cases? And the staff knowing how to reach out if necessary. Because sometimes calling 911 can take a bit, but the community police officer might actually be walking up and down the street where your office is. So really having those good relationship with the community police. Just a couple of things to remember. Safety planning is a conversation. Like I said before, handouts and checklists should just be used as a guide. A written plan could actually impact a survivor, so keeping in mind that if you have a safety plan written on a piece of paper that then gets dropped in her house and the abuser comes home from work, that is going to cause a major safety issue for a survivor. So that's why a lot of it is just conversation and saying, what do you want to do if? It's not a one-time event. Safety planning is an ongoing and living, breathing process. They safety plan from day to day because it depends on looking at, so how do we safety plan in this place versus this time? And something now has happened, so what's the new safety plan? It has to constantly be flexible and moving. It doesn't guarantee safety. It's just developing strategies to increase it. One of the big misnomers is people get this idea of like, now they're going to be safe. And we really come from a place of like, well, this might help them be safer, but we can never guarantee safety. And like I said, plans are individually tailored. They're built on their experience. So listen to them even if you don't understand. If a survivor says to you, it's safer if I let him come over every Thursday night and have sex with him, you need to be okay with that because that's what she is doing to make sure that the rest of the week, he's not kicking in her door and beating her down. So those are really real things. You have to listen to survivors, you have to believe what they tell you, and you have to go with what works for them. So core domestic violence services, all services are free, confidential, and inclusive. We do work with all survivors. I know this was very he, she oriented, but we do work with all survivors, and we do a lot of training with our folks around LGBTQ relationships and what do those relationships look like and what are some other things that we need to consider. Hotline, shelter, advocacy, case management, counseling and support groups, and community education and outreach is all of what we do, and most of the DV programs that you might encounter in other counties also do. We also, though, here in Albany have an elder abuse program, so we have a specialized case management project for folks who are 60 and above, because that looks a little bit different. So if you're safety planning with elders, there's a whole nother level of things to consider, particularly around if they have mobility issues or if they have health things that they need to consider. But we do have a special project for that. For further information, here you are. So every county has a program. Obviously, I'm the Albany County I shouldn't say I am. Equinox is the Albany County program. But Unity House is in Rensselaer County. Schenectady is the YWCA, and Saratoga County is Wellsprings. And then there's always the state hotline, and then the English and Spanish hotline. Sometimes people, if you have a person who has, I didn't bring this up, and it's not in here, and I should. I'm thinking that I did not talk about language challenges or interpretation services. It's super, super important. If you are working with a survivor of domestic, they disclose to you, or however you know that they are a victim of domestic violence, do not have family members interpreting these conversations. It's really difficult for that. Never have children doing it. And do not have family members doing it, because what we know, though, is that oftentimes if someone is, the communities are small, and there's a lot of things being said, and this person is now going to have all that information that survivor victim maybe didn't want them to know about, but because you're using them as a translator, they now know all that information. So it's really important to get outside translation services and make sure that it's going through someone who's reputable and trained. There are some times we've had to have some conversations with different interpreting agencies about things that interpreters are saying to our survivors. Like, we've had that happen where they're like, you should be ashamed of yourself, you need to go home, because of whatever religious background or whatever their cultural beliefs are. So you really need to know who you're working with. I just put that out there because it's super important, because there could be the difference between someone being safe and not being safe. So language stuff is another huge thing to consider. I know that the New York State hotline, or some of the hotlines, they can do the translation and go right through, at least to get someone connected with services if there's an emergency. But if any in doubt, call the 24-hour hotline numbers, and they can point you in the right direction. That was so fast. Any questions? Well, I'm not sure right now if there's anything in that specific law, but there are There has recently just been new legislation passed that if there's an order of protection, they immediately remove all guns. So they remove all guns from the home if there's an order of protection. So and now there's new systems being put in place so that way the orders of protection are being uploaded into a system more quickly. So that way it can happen more readily. It used to be, I mean, it's been a while that they've said you're supposed to do this, but there was no follow through on law enforcement. But now they will go right in and they can take out the guns. There's some other things that are happening in domestic violence laws, and one of the things that the governor just passed was that people can press charges from a different county. So if a victim flees from New York City and comes up here because they just had to get on a bus and leave, they can come to a police station here in Albany and file the report and file the charges to have them charged in New York. So that's super helpful. We're not, in the DV world, we're not 100% sure how they're going to handle some of the potential unintended consequences of that. But, you know, soon to come. But, I mean, these are positive things, but we always have to pay attention to kind of what's happening. I do want to put out there, too, though, if you're looking at putting together safety protocols or DV protocols, not your thing over here, for your agency, I really encourage you to give us a call because we've done this for a really long time, and we can take a look at safety protocols and policies and things, and we can really give you some insight as to maybe how you might want to tweak them so that you're not creating unintended consequences for yourselves. Again, things are put together for really good reasons and well intentions, but there's some things that you just might not think that would be a problem. So we would be more than welcome to do that.
You just received HUD funding that's going to go into effect as of September 1. Will any of this stuff be rolled into what you're doing with the DV coordinated entry funding?
Yes, there will be soon to come. We haven't figured out what that looks like yet, but yes, we did get DV coordinated entry money. We are partnering with Haddis, who runs the coordinated entry stuff for Albany, and we are going to be figuring out what that all looks like for housing programs. How do we, well, because now there's more housing dedicated to domestic violence victims, even permanent housing, which was not in the past. They were not a population that had their own dedicated beds. So we're looking at how does a victim go through the coordinated entry process if they want to into the other programs that are available to them, because they're just people, right? They have a right to access those services if they so choose. So how do we work with them in order to be able to do that safely? So that's where more training would be coming in. So if somebody wants to go into one of your housing programs, we can work with the agencies to say how does that happen and do that safely and confidentially and all that kind of stuff, which we've been doing for a while, and we've been not doing it at 100% best, but we're looking at that. But then also, how do we have people access the beds that are dedicated for DV victims, and what does that look like? So, any other questions?